The first thing that my natural reaction is to think of all the ways that that won't work. And what generally happens is that squelches your creativity and squelches your idea, and you're left with nothing. One of the things that Six Hats does, by separating the creativity from looking at the risks and cautions, from looking at the benefits, you get to have a line of creativity that can evolve into a different design, rather than being squelched immediately.
And I think, stepping back from the details for a moment, which is not to say that they are not important and in some cases, I think, life-changing for some people. Mm-hmm. I think one lesson I get from this is that you can appear to have a very intractable situation, an institution which has been working the same way for generations and now would like to work differently. How do you change? How do you get from the past into something else? And, you know, the answer is not going to be clear, the answer is not going to be easy, but individual steps are possible in some cases because people have thought about this already and tools are out there, ready to be used. What's required is the knowledge of the tools and the brains and the wisdom and the compassion often to use them.
And the willingness.
And the willingness. You know, I said compassion instead of willingness because I was thinking that it's such a human thing. And you want to stop acting as if you were the one with all the answers. Or alternatively, that you were the one with none of the answers, as some people would think.
Anytime you're delving into a new area, anytime you deal with change, there's going to be a great deal of fear, and you're going to make some mistakes. But if you never risk changing, you're going to fail.
So let me ask you a question on behalf of really hard-nosed people who could only see one value in such things. Do you feel it makes you and the orchestra play better?
Ultimately, yes. I think the mere fact that I and many of my colleagues are learning something new creates a spark. I think the fact that we are changing and evolving creates a kind of excitement in what's going on. I think the music director we have responds to change and experiment in a way that encourages us to be flexible. All these things make me personally much more engaged and present at a performance.
Mm. And there's also a lot to be said about a quality of really active listening to each other and getting on each other's musical wavelength. We've all seen these moments in performances where two people or an orchestra and suddenly a soloist somehow say the same thing in a phrase. And it's actually so remarkable how often it doesn't happen, I think. And the sign of that is how struck by it we are when it does. And I can imagine that if the things we're talking about become more widespread, that it could happen more often because you would naturally be on somebody else's wavelength.
The skill of listening is very important. It's very important to a musician. It's very important to a person. But to truly listen, you're fully engaged in that moment and responsive to it.
Yeah, because it goes beyond the more quantifiable questions of balance, ensemble, and intonation. It gets down to the precise inner thing that's happening. So how much has this taken root in your orchestra? Is it still a very new thing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And change, I believe, happens slowly over time and happens faster during crisis, but is not necessarily as speedy after the crisis is over.
But then we can bring in your music director, for whom it's his first year, right?
Yes.
And this is David Robertson, who is certainly one of the most highly touted and highly respected conductors of his generation. I guess he's, mid-40s now, about
That's
45.
correct.
And this is his first major music director position in America, certainly.
Yes.
He was much talked about by whoever talks about these things, certainly critics, as a potential candidate for any place that you could name. And he ended up in St. Louis. And you already said that he brings a spirit of openness and a willingness to experiment. What has that been like?
For me, it's very exciting to have someone on the podium who is constantly present, constantly listening to his musicians and going with them. If he hears something he likes, he changes the next thing to go with it. He rehearses us so that there are sort of minimum and maximum tempos, and he can put it any place in between in an actual performance, depending on how things are going. For me, it generates a great deal of excitement. And he's got wonderful ideas. He experiments with how to create the best placement, physical placement on stage of the orchestra for any given piece.
So he will change small details of where somebody sits? How does this work?
Well, it depends on how small you consider your detail.
Yeah.
While it's not unusual for some pieces to split the firsts and seconds across the stage for reasons of how the piece is written,
right.
He will switch the violas and the cellos. He will switch the basses from one
so
side
big
to another.
Changes.
Yeah, our stage crew is busy. And there's actually been one time where our stage change was so major and took so much time that he instructed us to go into the audience and mix with the audience.
I was about to ask you about that. That was after a Steve Reich piece. Is that correct?
I don't remember which piece
because
it was.
I heard about it from your concertmaster, David Halen.
Yeah.
And then I heard it also from David Robertson. And both of them, they loved it. Did you? Were you involved?
Well, I had the option. Unfortunately, I'm way back in the stage, so I didn't go. I left it to the violins. The stage change took over 10 minutes. And all the string players they left out the rehearsal stairs. They just walked directly into the audience, roamed around, talked to the patrons. I've heard from people in other cities who were there how much they enjoyed it. And people were a lot less bored during that stage change.
Well, I should think that's an odd thing about classical concerts anyway, that the stage changes are just this dead time. Nothing goes on. You forget, from my point of view, that you're up there with an audience and that you are giving a show. You just stop that and everybody talks quietly among themselves and you change the stage. But this is very radical. It reminds me of, I've worked with the Cleveland Orchestra, and I was involved in the first ever time that anybody spoke from the stage of Severance Hall to the audience during a concert. Franz Felsenhurst and I, their music director, talked for 3.5 minutes about the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, which he was about to conduct. So then I go out in the audience because I want to hear it, and as I'm going backstage after the concert to reconnoiter with all the people I'm working with there, somebody from the audience stops me, recognizes me, and says, with great excitement, "You broke down the wall between them and us." Now, if 3.5 minutes of conversation can break down the wall, how about the orchestra funneling out into the house to talk to people?
It was wonderful. It was really very special. And it kept the life, the energy of the concert flowing through that otherwise, as you said, dead time. We also recently, for New Year's Eve, we did the Charlie Chaplin film City Lights, which is a silent film with just a little bit of soundtrack.